As the stories we tell get retold across the ages, they change. Written by different hands, spoken by different voices, these tales are decontextualized and recontextualized 1,000 times over. And in few places is this more realized than in the canonical histories of the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons. Across the ages, sages and scholars futilely attempt to piece together the truth, an accurate historical record of the gods, elves, and ancient things now lost to time immemorial. But as the ages pass, these histories are sifted through the sieve of time until they become mere legend. A mythology so aged and changed from retellings that no one alive still remembers the truth of the tale. But what is the truth? If history is merely the stories we tell ourselves, then our understanding of the past is not a fixed, objective truth, but rather a narrative constructed through the stories we choose to tell and believe about events. And like matter passing into a sphere of annihilation, the truth is inescapably destroyed forever. Or is it? For though it is in legend that we inevitably lose the exact truth of what was, it is also in legend where we tend to find the truths that are. My name is William Stark, and this is D&D Legends and Lore. Before time began, before the fabled realm known as the Feywild had been fully formed from the vibrant echoes of the material plane, there was Arborea. Home to many of the gods, Arborea was a vast and wondrous place. Here were the crystalline seas from which life, both passionate and wild, sprung forth into being. Nascent, mortal creatures who would, in time, find homes upon the infinite worlds of the multiverse, awakening beneath the light of 1,000 suns. Here lay verdant meadows as vibrant and hardy as the gods who walked upon them. Here grew divine gardens of serene beauty that resembled vast and glorious sunsets. Here was Arvandor, forest home of the Seldarine, gods of the elves. A vast, infinite expanse of pristine wilderness covered in lush forests, snow-capped mountains, perfectly clear streams, and serene lakes. The deep woods of Arvandor possess an unearthly beauty, amplified by the presence of the celestial elves, who have spent countless eons cultivating and influencing both plant and beast of this ancient realm. And none know the secrets and mysteries of the wood better than the elven deities who call this place home. And it truly is their home and few others, for the otherworldly beauty and passion of Arvandor is overwhelming to the mortal soul. Those few mortals that find their way here find the call of Arvandor's enticing song and sweet life-giving air to be nearly irresistible. Those that cannot resist the passionate call are overtaken by the desire to dance and frolic without end, communing with nature in all its splendor. And if such mortals are not guided away, they risk becoming lost to that mindless reverie forevermore. Such was and is the beauteous wonder of Arvandor. And it was to Arvandor that Corellon and Gruumsh fled. Wounded and shaken, the elf lord stumbled through the moors of a place far from his home. First of the Seldarine, father of elven kind, Corellon Lolth was a being of lithe golden beauty. And though gravely wounded, he still moved with the unearthly grace and speed of a god of elves. But on his face he bore a look of frustration and dark foreboding, and in his hand he held an empty scabbard. His eyes swept the hills from which he retreated. Upon a distant cresting hill he caught a glimpse of his foe. Corded with muscle and armored in the hide of great beasts, he stood in a hunter's stance, his bear-like nose twitching as he scented the air for the passing of the elf lord, and the iron spear he wielded dripped with fresh blood as he stalked. Gruumsh, first power of the Orcish lords. Long and storied was their enmity, and this particular battle between them had been long and fierce. The Orc god bled nearly as profusely as Corellon, but the difference between them was that Gruumsh still held his weapon, while Corellon's sword, the legendary blade Sahandrian, lay in shattered ruins on the moor. Corellon was a warrior, the father of all elven warriors, and he wanted nothing more than to stand and see the battle through to its conclusion. But with his weapon shattered and his honor bound not to use his godly magic against his foe, there was no choice but to retreat. For if Corellon and Lolth were to fall, then surely so too would his children, the elven people. How had the orc god managed to shear through Sahandrian's godly magic and metal with a single blow? It should not have been possible. Treachery, Corellon concluded grimly. There was no other explanation. Only elven high magic could counter the very same that was concentrated into his blade. But why? How had it come to this? For what purpose would one of his own turn against him? This question, a question Corellon had never before thought or needed to ask, haunted him as he watched the twilight purple of the sky and Gruumsh draw ever closer. In the age before ages, long before the existence of elves or men, in a time before even the material worlds had settled into permanence, Corellon danced across creation. From world to world and plane to plane, a being of consummate mutability and infinite grace, of both endless passion and perfect serenity, Corellon was a god like no other. Able to take the form of a chuckling stream, a teasing breeze, an incandescent beam, an alluring flame, or a thunderous bolt of lightning. On a whim, Corellon's body could become a school of fish, a swarm of bees, or a flock of birds. When consorting with other gods, he often adopted their appearances, be they male, female, or something else entirely. But just as often, he kept their company in the form of a rose blossom or a delicate doe, Corellon's brilliant, mercurial personality showing through no matter which form the god took. He loved wholeheartedly and took pleasure from every encounter with the other divine beings of the multiverse. In turn, most of the gods accepted Corellon's mutability and passionate behavior. Most, but not all. Gruumsh, god of conquest and strength, was legendary for his wrath and physical prowess, and was nearly universally respected among the divine powers. But Corellon blithely took no heed of Gruumsh or his might. At best, he ignored the god's presence entirely, and at worst, he cleverly and covertly mocked him. To Gruumsh, this disrespect was not to be tolerated. Only, the gods had more pressing matters to deal with at that time. For as the gods, beings of ideal thought and order, had turned their attention to the universe outside their domains, they came across beings as ancient and powerful as themselves, the primordials. God-like beings made of manifest entropy and elemental energy, entities of raw fire, earth, lightning, ice, and every other combination of elemental material. These beings were formed from the churning elemental chaos, and from those same raw materials they forged the first world. Vast and chaotic, this world was an untamed amalgamate of wastelands, high mountains, deep valleys, and countless other scenes both stark and awesome strewn across its grand creation. Looking down on this work, the gods were fascinated. Being the creatures of thought and ideal that they were, they saw endless room for improvement in the primordials' work, and their imaginings took form and substance from the abundance of creation stuff still drifting in the cosmos. Life spread across the face of the world. The churning elements resolved into oceans and land masses. Diffused light became a sun and moon and stars. But most crucially, what the gods' ideals and order had forced upon this creation was permanence. The gods had given the world permanence utterly alien to the primordials' nature. The primordials, beings of constant change and motion, saw their creation not as a static bauble to be admired, but as something ephemeral and fleeting, a thing to be recycled and remade into something else, unto eternity. So when the world's new permanence became apparent to them, it meant war. The primordials besieged the gods and the structure and order they imposed on their creation with unbridled wrath. The seas churned and boiled. The earth shook and crumbled. The wind raged and scoured. The Dawn War had begun. Gruumsh was one of the first to enter the fray in defense of the world's existence. In countless battles, he slew primordials great and small, winning victory after victory for the side of the gods. It is said that his strength was limitless and that he never rested nor relented against his foe. Corellon, on the other hand, due to his distractible nature, did not join the fray until late into the war. Yet, it is said that the elven god's devotion to the war once joined was second to none. On the battlefield, Wielding both magic and blade, there perhaps had never been a sight so majestic and terrifying as Corellon Lorthian carving his way through the primordial titans. He was praised as a champion and a savior by the other gods, and Gruumsh grew ever more spiteful and jealous. Corellon had joined the war late. He had far less victories and had done far less for the war effort than Gruumsh himself had. Yet the beauty and grandeur of his exploits afforded him far more praise and adoration than the Orc Lord. Gruumsh's thoughts darkened when he thought of Corellon Lorthian. Eventually, the primordials were defeated. Those not dead were sealed deep within the elemental chaos, never to meddle in the affairs of the material plane again. And so the gods began to divide their spoils. And whether out of careless ignorance or simply ill-played playfulness, Corellon decided to play a prank on Gruumsh. For the gods, in their infinite wisdom, had decided to convene and draw lots in order to decide how to divide up the world between themselves. Corellon conspired with his fellow deities. Would it not be delightful to fool the war god, however briefly, into thinking he had lost the drawing and no part of the world would be his? Well, Corellon must have been quite convincing, because he got his way. When the gods met to draw lots to decide the parts of the world they would populate with their peoples, Corellon drew the lot which gave him green forests and bright woodland. Moradin, father of the dwarves, drew the lot which gave him the riches of the mountains. Garl Glittergold received the sunlit rocky hills for his gnomes, and Yolanda, the mother of halflings, picked the lot which gave them the rolling fields and meadows. With all the lots drawn, the assembled gods turned to Gruumsh and laughed loud and long. "All the lots are taken," they said tauntingly. "Where will your people dwell? There is no place left." Gruumsh stared at his so-called fellow deities as his wrath and hatred seethed within him. How he despised them all. They did not respect him despite his strength. They did not value him despite what his might brought them. And his eyes fell upon Corellon, the worst of his offenders. This had been a long time coming. A silence fell upon the world. Gruumsh lifted his great iron spear and stretched it across the sky. The shaft blotted out the sun over a great part of the land as he spoke.
"No, you lie. You have rigged the drawing of lots, hoping to cheat me and those who follow me. There is no place for the orcs to dwell, you say? I disagree. They will dwell here."
His spear pierced the mountains, opening mighty rifts and chasms.
"And here."
The spearhead split the hills and made them shake, covering them in dust.
"And here."
The black spear gouged the meadows and made them barren.
"There. There is where the orcs shall dwell, and they shall survive and multiply and grow stronger. And a day will come when they cover the world, and they shall slay all of your collected peoples."
The gods were horrified, and Corellon saw that his joke had gone too far. He attempted to calm the Orc Lord, to tell him that the lots were done in jest and no harm was meant. But it was too late. Gruumsh leapt at Corellon and the battle began. It was a clash of titans, the raw power of the Orc god raging against the mercurial majesty of Corellon Lorthian. It is said the battle between them stretched across worlds, across plains. Both gods' blood spilled across the land. But in the end, Corellon was victorious as his sword struck out the Orc god's left eye. The now one-eyed god cursed Corellon before being forced to retreat. Corellon stood victorious, but wounded. He had only meant to tease the war god, not to enrage him to violence. But Corellon, had he the wisdom to brood over these events, did not have time. For it is said that from his spilled blood on this day, the first of the elves sprang forth into being. Of his blood, they were his children, and he came to love them with a deep fierceness. Ages had passed since that day, and now Corellon faced his demise by the very same ancient foe. The Orc Lord approached, and as he did, the single moon of Arborea crested a distant hill. An amber orb that paled to silver as it rose, its light sent a wide, moon-cast shadow stretching out before the Orc Lord. Then, a slight movement on the horizon caught Gruumsh's eye. It was little more than a shimmer, like the colored lights that dance in the cold northern skies of the material worlds. The Orc god watched with apprehension as the dancing lights coalesced into a slender, feminine form. Sehanine Moonbow, elven goddess of moonlight and mysteries. Youthful yet ageless, silver hair flowing over her diaphanous gown, Sehanine walked toward the Orc Lord, and in her hands was a shining sword held pointed up before her. And not just any sword, but a living blade. It was as alive as any verdant world and all the beings that walked upon it, as vast in power as the sun that warmed that world. Within its blade, thousands of tiny stars swirled and magic pulsed through it like an ocean's tide. It was Sahandrian, the sword of Corellon, made whole and new. Gruumsh let out a furious bellow that rumbled like thunder over the moor. The proudest moment of the Orc Lord's godhood had been shattering that sword and watching the glowing fragments fade and disappear into nothing. Yet somehow, this great triumph had been undone. He aimed his spear at the goddess, intending to strike her down from a distance, but the faint sound alerted his target. Sehanine leveled the blade at the Orc Lord as if it were a wizard's staff, and from it a single pulse of silver light burst from the weapon, engulfing and blinding the Orc god. By the time his vision returned, the goddess had moved far beyond the range of his spear. She stood beside his prey, Corellon Larethian, and held out before her his legendary blade. The lights that whirled within the elven weapon flared and leapt as the rightful owner reclaimed it. Gruumsh howled with fury.
Weakling, coward, bested in single combat, and you hide behind this goddess's skirt. What of your oath? You swore that no elven magic would be brought against me, yet you suffer this witch to undo my victory.
It was Sahanine's silvery voice that rose up against the Orc Lord.
Not so. It is you who has broken the truce, Gruumsh of the Orcs, and thus it will be remembered for all time. Corellon holds to the contract he has made with you, and to all the tenets of honorable battle. He was never bested, and destroying his sword was no victory of yours. By an elf, Sahandrian was undone. By an elf were you bidden here, and thus it falls to us to restore our own.
Seething with rage, the Orc Lord charged both the elven gods. Corellon raised high Sahandrian and rose to meet the Orc Lord's charge. They met with a thunderous clash. Sparks flew like shooting stars as the elven blade struck the haft of the Orc Lord's spear. Despite his wounds, agility was ever Corellon's ally against the overwhelming raw power of Gruumsh's strength. For many moments the foes stood nearly toe-to-toe, and the clashing and striking of metal upon metal rang out over the watchful moor. But as Gruumsh saw his victory slowly slipping away, he let out a furious roar and made one final lumbering swing of his weapon. A deciding blow to end this now, before it was too late. The Orc Lord heard the horrid sound of metal sliding wetly over bone. He felt the sudden easing of resistance as the blade slipped down. Then, all other sensation vanished in a white-hot explosion of pain. Gruumsh clutched at his one good eye, which was blinded by the copious flow of blood from the gaping wound in his head. He dashed the blood from his face and squinted with wrath at Corellon Larethian. But when he spoke, he did so with bitter satisfaction.
You know nothing. You can't even begin to understand that you've already lost. You don't even know the names of your foes. As for my defeat, kill me now, if you can, and let it be witness that you struck down a wounded and unarmed foe.
Corellon's eyes bore into the Orc god for a long moment. Then, without a word, Corellon left Gruumsh where he lay and turned once more toward Arvandor, where he knew his true enemy lie in wait. When the first elves sprang forth from Corellon's spilled blood, they were much akin to their father, not nearly as powerful, but just as changeable and adventurous. Splendid fey creatures, they traveled in Corellon's shadow, sparkling like the reflections from a finely cut gem. Corellon came to love these beings, appreciating their ideas, personalities, and forms which were both novel and familiar to him. Together they made a home in the high forest of Arvandor. The greatest of these first elves would go on to become the Soldarine, the fellowship of brothers and sisters of the wood, and the elven pantheon of gods. Together, they had a hand in creating those that would go on to become the mortal elven peoples of the material plane. But among the Soldarine, there was one who shone brightest. Her form was most beautiful of all elves, then and since. Her voice was sweetest, and her creations were the most vibrant. She named herself Arashni, goddess of destiny, artisans, and beauty. And Corellon was enchanted. He felt for her a deep love, so deep that his mercurial form finally settled for the first time since time before time. Though he could and still would change forms as he pleased, what pleased him most was to become Arashni's perfect counterpart. A warrior to her artist, sun-bright golden hair to her dark unearthly beauty. He gifted her powers above the other gods, and he chose her as his bride, and the two were wed. But all was not well for long. A dark ambition lied in Arashni's heart. She entertained ideas counter to her lover and lord's life-loving, passionate ethos. She whispered and weaved an enticing tale of how the elves could and should attain superiority over the other beings of the multiverse. How they could rise to true greatness if only they would take it. But when she spoke of such things, Corellon laughed. He adored his queen. He would lavish upon her any and all gifts. He would give her power and magic of the highest order should she ask it. But at this, he scoffed and chided her as if she was a child. Within Arashni, a discontentment grew, eventually turning to resentment. Admiration turned to jealousy, and love became a seething hatred. What husband would laugh at his wife? What leader would choose not to lead his people to greatness? Who was Corellon to doubt her, to mock her, the greatest of all elves? Who was he to give her power? No, she decided. True power is not given. It is seized. And so she plotted. She sowed the seeds of discord amongst her fellow Soldarine, finding few allies, but making use of the weaknesses in their unity that she could exploit. She seduced the aloof and self-serious Fanmaril Mestarin, the elven god of rebels and outcasts, and further pushed him away from their fellow Soldarine. She brought her firstborn son Veyrun, who showed promise in both the ways of trickery and war, into the folds of her ambition, raising him to disdain his father. As she sought more power, her machinations spread beyond the realm of Arvandor. She consorted with demons, set the beast lord Malar on Corellon while wounded, and conspired with the orc lord Gruumsh to do away with her husband for good. She met with the orc god, whispering sweet promises of revenge and assured victory. She offered to sabotage her lord's blade so that it would shatter and fail him in battle. And when Gruumsh agreed to challenge Corellon yet again, she advised her husband to meet this challenge.
Do away with this lumbering oaf who destroys and makes ugly all he touches. Meet him in battle and run him through. Better yet, swear to forego even your godly magic in this bout. Shame him so thoroughly he might never return to vex us so.
And as she whispered sweet nothings in her husband's ear, she weaved a curse upon his scabbard, so that any blade drawn from it would shatter and be undone. Like a spider, Arashni weaved her web, and none were the wiser, or so she thought. For as the elf goddess schemed and conspired by the dark of night, the silver moon hung high above and saw all that its light touched. Sehanine Moonbow, daughter of the night skies, goddess of moonlight, the lunar lady, the lady of dreams. Many are her names, the elven goddess whose power waxes and wanes with the phases of the moon. It is said that she was born of the very first drop of blood to fall from Corellon Larethian in his legendary bout with Gruumsh One-Eye, As such, she was the first to make Corellon aware of his own mortality. She was first to hear his cry of pain at the wounds dealt to him by Gruumsh, and the first to hear his laugh of delight at discovering her kind. She was first to calm him, first to chide him. She was first to follow him. She was first to love him. And though Corellon's eyes were ultimately for another, she did not despair. She loved him all the same, as she loved all her fellow elves. As such, cloaked in secrets, illusions, and all the magic of the moon, Sehanine sought to protect Corellon, the elven people, and all of Arvandor. High above the highest snow-capped peak, Sehanine watched by the light of the moon. She watched for Arvandor's enemies. She watched over the dreams of elves, keeping them from harm. She watched over the passage of elven spirits from the material world. She watched over the Lord of Elves himself. Thus it was that she alone was witness to Arashni's betrayal. She watched as the Weaver cast a curse on Corellon's scabbard. She cried out at seeing Sahandrian shatter. She poured all her godly magic into reforging the blade. And her heart swelled with pride both at Corellon's victory over Gruumsh and in the kindness he showed at sparing the Orc Lord's life. And now that the Elf Lord was safe, the time had come to confront the traitor in their midst. She feared what the knowledge might do to Corellon, should he learn it was his own beloved wife who was at this treachery's heart. She sought out Arashni, hoping to dissuade her from further madness. On motes of moonlight, Sehanine descended upon the grand hall of Arashni's palace, her silver hair shining with iridescent light. There, she saw her, Arashni, queen consort of the elven pantheon. Upon seeing the elven goddess of beauty and artistry, Sehanine was made acutely aware yet again how Corellon fell in love with such unrivaled beauty. The moon goddess's silver voice broke the silence.
I name you, Arashni, traitor to the Seldarian, conspirator with our enemies. This is your work, is it not?
Sehanine tossed an empty scabbard to the ground between them.
No one else in all of Arvandor could make such a wondrous weave. Convenient that the runes upon it are so similar to those that would give protection from an attack. Few could notice the difference at a glance. Convenient as well that you prefer to do your dark deeds in the cooler hours of the night, after midnight, when the moon shines brightest.
As Sehanine spoke, Arashni's eyes widened, the implication of the moon goddess's words dawning upon her. How could she have been such a fool? In her self-assured arrogance, she had allowed her treachery to be witnessed firsthand by this jealous wench. This would-be rival, could anyone rival her? Action needed to be taken. Now.
These are serious accusations you set at my feet, dear sister. Tell me, if you are so certain of my treachery, why have you not informed my dear husband?
I would dissuade you of this madness. It would break his heart to know what you have done. I would spare him the pain, and you the shame, if you would end this treason now.
I see.
Arashni's eyes wandered as her mind raced, searching for a solution to this unforeseen complication in her plan. They came to rest on the horizon, just as the light of the rising sun pierced through the clouds.
Then it is convenient for me that you have come as the night gives way to day and your power wanes.
Flinging out both hands, the dark goddess let the full force of her wrath and jealousy fuel the magic she poured from her fingertips. Malevolent power spun at the moon goddess in silky threads. Within seconds, Sehanine was meshed in a web far stronger than any weaving Arashni had spun before. But this was not enough. Arashni's rage stirred up a tempest, a wind that howled and raged along the walls of the hall until it formed a whirling cloud. The whirlwind caught the struggling moon goddess and tossed her into the very heart of the tiny maelstrom. There, Arashni weaved more raw magic around the moon goddess until she was as tightly bound as a cocoon. A smile curved her lips as she regarded the captured goddess, helplessly struggling against her restraints. But as quickly as her satisfaction came, it went. For she knew that Sehanine's power would heighten upon moonrise. There was little time. Her final plan had to be set in motion, and quickly. Arashni summoned her son Veyrun, her closest confidant and ally. She knew he could be trusted. For now.
Take her as swiftly as you can from this place, and as far as you can take her without being seen. There is little time. It begins now.
After the birth of the first elves, it was not long before elvenkind, blessed with beauty, grace, and long lives, cavorted across the various planes of existence. They spread from Arvandor to other worlds, as wanderlust and curiosity drove them to the far reaches of the multiverse. On those other worlds, the elves developed the forms of culture and society that are now associated with their people. Much like their father deity, these elves possess strong but swiftly passing passions, being moved easily to laughter, anger, or misery, and as quickly calmed. They became known for their impulsive behavior, and as a result, many saw them as flighty or impetuous. They had an affinity for freedom of expression, and freedom from the strict laws of what others called civilized society. Like Corellon, the elves delighted in the simple joys of song and dance and in the creation of things beautiful and wonderful. Like Corellon, they dismissed what they found ugly or uninteresting with arrogant nonchalance. And like Corellon, the elves of the mortal realms made many enemies. Arashni had been secretly weaving her web for some time now, and even Sehaneen's prescience has its limits. Unlike the moon goddess, Arashni was aware of the growing enmity the elven people had been garnering, and she welcomed this long list of enemies for two reasons. One, she meant to use these enemies as a platform to her ascension. Two, when she eventually ruled the Sildarine and by proxy all of elfkind, these enemies would be the first to fall on the path to elven superiority. Seldom did the gods of the Sildarine travel from Arvandor, except to tend to the needs of and nurture their elven children. But Arashni traveled to many strange and dire places, seeking out the enemies of the Sildarine. To the gods of the orcs and ogres, to the goblinkin, hobgoblins, bugbears, the evil dragons, and the creatures of the sky and the deepest sea, Arashni carried her seeds of war. Even to the eldritch abomination Ganadwar, chaotic evil god of abominations and oozes, did Arashni whisper promises of conquest and slaughter, and they would all heed her call. The time was now. Corellon was wounded, Sehaneen captured. Arashni would open the way for Arvandor's enemies to besiege the Sildarine. Then, in the chaos and confusion of battle, Arashni would initiate her master stroke. There was only one thing left to do to assure her victory. Arashni called her daughter to attend her. Tall and lithe, with ankle-length silver hair, Alistra'i, daughter of Arashni and Corellon, arrived as quick as the wind. She may have inherited her mother's beauty. She also inherited her father's grace and strength. There were few who could match the young elf goddess's speed or prowess with a hunting bow. Arashni stared assessingly at her daughter. She had little use for this one. The girl adored her father and emulated him in all the ways Arashni hated most. Unlike her brother, Arashni could not trust this one to understand her grand vision. Yes, she had little use for Alistra'i, but not no use.
My little raven, I have a task for you. It will bring your father joy. Listen, and tell me if it pleases you.
Alistra'i stalked the deep woods far from her home, as silent as a shadow. Long had been her search, but she had finally found it. Her father's scabbard, lost in the fight with Gruumsh from which he had returned with so grievous a wound. Perhaps this would please him as her mother claimed, but as she pondered the thought, Alistra'i became acutely aware that she was not the only one being silent in the woods. The forest around her was silent. The treants were in a deep enchanted slumber. The birds were hushed at a time they should have been singing their morning summons to the sun. Then she smelled it. Blood. Alistra'i, as quick as the wind, climbed nimbly into the arms of an ancient oak tree. From this tree she moved to another, and then another, tracking by scent alone. But her eyes were keen, and she moved nearly as fast among the trees as she could while on the ground. Soon, she saw the source of her disquiet. There were 100 of them, perhaps more, and all of them gods. Gods of the enemies of her people. All of them armed far past the demands of a hunt, and they marched on with grim determination on a direct path toward Arvandor. Elystrae knew what she needed to do. Setting her jaw in determination, she sped lightly through the treetops to do as duty bid her. And in her heart was a certain amount of pride that it would be she who would sound the alarm. The gods of the Seldarine swiftly gathered to meet the approaching threat. From 100 worlds and from every corner of the sacred elven forest they came, and with them stood the gods of the other fairy folk. The pixies, the sprites, as well as the immortal unicorns, centaurs, and wild-eyed fauns marched alongside the elves. All the powers of Arvandor rallied in uncommon unity against the threat. They gathered and awaited Corellon Larethian's command. First to strike was Airdrie Fienna, elven goddess of the air. From her outstretched hand came buffeted winds and fierce lightning strikes that sent the attacking army staggering back. For a brief time, it appeared that the invaders might be swept from the forest by Airdrie's wrath alone. But the enemy was eager to test their power against the elves. An icy wind swept from the north, bearing upon it the goddess Auril, evil deity of winter and cold. In her wake came winter storms that made the worst of Airdrie's attacks seem like gentle breezes. Grappling in midair, the goddesses were borne swiftly away on the maelstrom of their own battle. It was then that the anti-Seldarine horde charged, and to the horror of the elven gods, they passed easily through Arvandor's wall of protective magic. As Corellon witnessed the defilement of the sacred forest, he dwelt on the words of the one-eyed god.
You can't understand what you've already lost. You don't even know the names of your foes.
Only an elven god could alter the magic that protected Arvandor, just as only an elven god could counter the magic within his sword. But who was it? There was no time. The enemy was upon them. Corellon took a long, steadying breath and turned his eyes to the enemy that he could see, and shouted as he led the charge toward the onrushing horde. The battle raged for hours. Blood soaked the ground of the sacred wood. Pushed on all sides, Corellon fought on, as did all who defended Arvandor. Gods do not die easily, but seldom was there fighting such as this among them. There were losses on both sides, and for many long hours it was not clear who would prevail. But as the battle drew on, Arvandor and its allies gained the upper hand. The horde was breaking and beginning to retreat. The battle was nearly over. Arvandor secure, Corellon nodded in satisfaction and thrust his sword back into its scabbard. An odd, tingling feeling sizzled up his hand as his fingers brushed the magic weave of the sheath. But before he had time to dwell on it, he was struck by an overwhelming sense of evil. As he tried to move, he found that he could not. Looking down, he saw a viscous, sickly green substance had oozed up from the ground and was holding him fast. Godswar, an ancient elemental evil of abominations. Corellon felt despair creep into his heart as he realized the extent of the treachery that was at play, for only the presence of true evil within Arvandor could open the door to a horror of such power. It was at this moment that a hulking ogre god charged the elf lord, seeing him as easy prey. Corellon reached for Sahendrian, but the sword would not come free of the sheath, clenched around it like a malevolent fist. In his startlement, Corellon's eyes came to rest upon the place where Roshni stood watching over the battlefield. The naked triumph on her face chilled him, as even the creeping horror of Godswar could not. But before he could absorb this shock, Elystrae's shriek tore his gaze from Roshni's gloating face. Corellon glanced at his daughter as she loosened an arrow from her bow at the ogre god that had him. One arrow, then two, three. A fourth arrow flew loose before the first had even landed. It was then that Corellon felt again the tingle run from his scabbard. As the arrows magically began to change course, Corellon realized exactly why his sword had shattered in his battle on the moor. The pain of his wife's treachery swept through him in great, crushing waves. He did not even feel his daughter's arrow pierce his chest. The battle was won, but at what cost? Eilestrae lay restrained by Airdre Fienna for the attempted assassination of her own father. The Seldarine clustered around their leader. They watched in respectful silence as Arashne knelt at her fallen husband's side with tear-streaked face. The arrow that pierced his chest had been removed and the wound healed by elven magic, but Corellon did not stir. He was not dead. Instead, there was about him an immobilizing despair, as if the evil he'd fought that long day had seeped into his soul, leaving him in a state between life and death. As the gods discussed a way of reviving their lord, Arashne brought forth a mysterious vial of liquid.
Water from Elysium, infused with healing herbs from the heart of our Vandor. This will restore him.
This was it, Arashne's final gambit. How she had waited for this. The vial she held in her hand was no healing tonic, but a poison of the deadliest variety. It would not kill him, such was the difficulty of slaying a god such as Corellon, but it would plunge the leader of the Seldarine into an eternal slumber, leaving a vacuum of power among the Seldarine, one she meant to fill. And if the nature of her husband's death-like slumber should ever be discovered, Arashne would disclose a simple but devastating truth. It was Eilestrae who gathered the herbs and brewed the potion. Assured of her victory, Arashne knelt to administer her poison. Suddenly, a ray of moonlight struck with lightning speed, dashing the vial to the ground. Sahanine Moonbow stood among the Seldarine once again. Her face was statuesque and serene, but her eyes burned with righteous fury. Arashne's face contorted with rage. How had she escaped? She glared at her son Veyron. He had failed her. It was then that Arashne lost all composure.
One more day, and I would have had everything. I would have had such power that you could have done nothing.
The Seldarine watched in shock as Arashne raised her hand to strike the moon goddess, but the weaver was halted by the moon goddess's words.
Enough. Your words betray you, Arashne. Be mindful that the council that will consider these words stands here in witness of what you have said and done.
And who will call this council? None here are Corellon's equal, and none but him can convene a council.
Sahanine glanced at her fellow Seldarine. The goddesses Airdre Fienna and Hanali Selanil, the elven goddess of love, met her gaze. A moment of silence passed between the three before they came to flank Sahanine Moonbow. From them all rose a luminous mist, one that coalesced into a single goddess of impossible beauty and daunting power. Arashne, beholding this nascent goddess, knew with certainty that she beheld her own successor.
I am Angarath,
the new goddess said in a voice that was wind, moonlight, and music.
From the essence of the three greatest elven goddesses am I born. I am three, and I am one. 3, to ensure that treachery never again enters the heart of a goddess of our Vandor. And 1, to stand at Corellon's side.
The triune goddess touched her hand lightly to Corellon's head and again to his heart. His wounds closed and the dark aura that clung to him parted. The elf lord opened his eyes at last, but they settled not on the wondrous Angarath, but upon Arashne. His gaze held both terrible heartbreak and equally strong resolve. Then he spoke.
A great evil has entered our midst. We must confront it now, for the sake of the Seldarine and all our elven children. The council is convened. Let any who would speak freely.
And so Sahanine stepped forward from the form of Angarath and told her story. She started with her suspicions of Arashne's enchanted scabbard. She spoke of witnessing the battle with Gruumsh and the shattering of Corellon's sword. She told of her own foolishness in approaching Arashni, of her capture by the Dark Goddess's web, and her son's part in carrying her to some far-flung dark depth. And in a few terse words, she confessed how she escaped her imprisonment, and alluded to a great power she had given up to do so. Corellon listened intently, but he absconded himself from the passing of judgment. He had made enough mistakes in judgment across the ages that had led to the events of this day. He would leave any further judgment to the collective. In one voice, the Saldarin announced their verdict: banishment. Corellon looked into Arashni's malevolent eyes. She stared defiance, and he realized that he had never truly seen her before today.
Why have you done this?
He asked softly. The Dark Goddess spoke.
I held in my hands the destinies of mortal beings. But were they ever truly mine? No. They are all devoutedly yours. The fools. You treated me, the one who shined the brightest of us all, as some possession to be cherished and coddled, all while standing in the way of everything I desired.
Never did I mean you disrespect. I loved you.
And you will live to regret it.
Corellon turned to his son Veyrun, who had been found guilty of aiding and abetting his mother.
Though you also betrayed us, you have earned a different fate. You are young, and merely followed your mother's bidding. It is tragic that this path led you into evil. You must learn to think and live on your own. In time, perhaps, you can redeem yourself and return to the fellowship of Arvandor. But for now, you must find a place in the mortal world alone.
Ilastra'i, who had been absolved of any wrongdoing, was released from her bonds and her wounds tended to. She stumbled to her father with tears of guilt in her eyes. Upon hearing the tale of her mother's treachery, she insisted on sharing Arashni and her brother Veyrun's fate. Corellon attempted to dissuade her, but the young goddess insisted, thinking of the elves who considered Arashni their guiding deity, and knowing that she would need to act as a balance against her mother's darkness. Corellon looked at Arashni and Veyrun.
Ilastra'i has chosen. Go now, and take her with you. But know that the day your hand is lifted against her will be the last of your life. This I swear by all the trees in Arvandor.
Finally, Corellon stood before his fallen love.
Arashni, your sentence has been spoken by the Saldarin. For what you have done, for what you have become, you are declared demon. Be what you are, and go where you must.
And with that, Arashni began to change. Her slender body grew to monstrous size. Her limbs lengthened, divided, and divided again. Arashni, the cunning weaver and the treacherous lover, had become a spider-shaped monstrosity. Most terrible of all was her face, for although her beauty was not altered, her visage was now stripped of artifice and twisted with hatred. Then a dark whirling portal opened up behind the spider elf goddess, and she was cast within. The Saldarin watched and listened to her voice cursing them all and swearing vengeance upon all things elven until it faded away and was lost in the howl of the abyssal wind. Corellon stood in sorrowful silence. The new goddess Angarath came to his side to comfort him. He stood for a long moment, reflecting on his past. How he had slighted the Orc Lord so long ago, and who in the end had nearly killed him. How he and his people had made many enemies the cosmos over. How he had been blind to his wife's ambitions, careless with her emotions, and deaf to her voice. And he saw in his children the same faults he now for the first time saw in himself.
The battle for the control of Arvandor is over. It seems that we have won. But I fear that for the elven people, the struggle has just begun.
Deep within the darkest pit known as the Abyss, Arashni stood over the dead body of the demon lord that once ruled this layer of the lower planes. She had challenged him, and she had slain him. It would seem this new form had its uses. This layer of the Abyss was hers now, as were the hordes of chaotic demons that constantly generated from its chaotic evil essence. In defeat, Arashni had found a victory of sorts. No, Arashni was an elf name, and she would destroy all things elven. From this day forth, she would be known by her true name. She would be known as Lolth, the Spider Queen. This has been D&D Legends and Lore. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know by leaving a like and comment below. I would be particularly interested in hearing suggestions for future topics for the show. And if you would like to see more narrative-driven, zoomed-in perspectives on stories that D&D's decades of lore have to offer, make sure to subscribe. You can also find us on Spotify, iTunes, and anywhere else podcasts can be found. Links will be in the description. Lastly, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can gain access to early, ad-free episodes as well as live play and homebrew D&D content. With that, I will say thank you for listening and happy adventuring.